What would you do if your best friend offered you $1,000,000 to buy your wife for one night? The poker chips clicked like broken promises across the mahogany table. Smoke curled through the amber light of Derek's private study, where money flowed as freely as the aged whiskey. Malcolm's hands trembled slightly as he studied his cards, not from the game, but from the mountain of debt crushing his chest like a vice. "Fold," he whispered, throwing down what should have been a winning hand. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, his predatory smile cutting through the haze. The billionaire's fingers drummed against his glass, each tap echoing like a countdown. "You know, Malcolm, I've been thinking about your situation." The room fell silent, except for the distant rumble of thunder outside. Malcolm's throat went dry as Derek reached into his jacket, producing a check already made out for $1,000,000. The zeros seemed to dance mockingly in the lamplight. "Your wife, Lillian," he said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "She's quite beautiful, isn't she?" He placed the check on the table between them, the paper catching the light like a trap waiting to spring. "One night. That's all I ask. One night with your wife, and all your debts disappear." Malcolm's world tilted. The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into his lungs until he couldn't breathe. Around the table, the other players shifted uncomfortably, but none dared speak. This was theater now, and they were unwilling witnesses to a man's soul being weighed against cold, hard cash. "Think about it," Derek continued, sliding the check closer. "Freedom, a fresh start, all for one night. Some offers are so vile, the answer should be instant. But what if it isn't?" The front door slammed with the force of Malcolm's shame as he stumbled into their modest apartment. Lillian looked up from her book, her dark eyes immediately catching the storm clouds gathering in her husband's face. The scent of expensive cigars and guilt clung to his clothes like accusations. "How much did you lose this time?" she asked, her voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. Malcolm's silence stretched between them like a chasm. When he finally spoke, the words tumbled out in a rush. Derek's proposition, the $1,000,000, the impossible choice. With each syllable, Lillian's face grew paler, her knuckles white as she gripped her book. "No." The word exploded from her lips like a gunshot. She stood, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Absolutely not. What kind of monster do you think I am? What kind of monster do you think you are?" Her voice cracked with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The book fell forgotten to the floor as she paced the small living room like a caged animal. "I am your wife, Malcolm, your wife, not some commodity to be bartered and sold." But when she turned to face him, expecting immediate agreement, expecting him to share her outrage, she found only silence. Malcolm stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw working wordlessly. The absence of his voice was deafening. "Say something," she whispered, her anger giving way to something far more terrifying. "Tell me this is insane. Tell me you said no." The seconds ticked by like drops of poison. In that suffocating silence, Lillian felt something precious and irreplaceable begin to crack inside her chest. Her faith in the man she'd married, her belief in their love, her trust in their sacred vows. Malcolm's continued silence spoke volumes, and what it said broke her heart. Sometimes betrayal isn't spoken, it's the silence that screams. The clock on the mantel ticked like a time bomb in the suffocating quiet. Malcolm's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came. His eyes darted everywhere except to Lillian's face, to the peeling wallpaper, the overdue bills scattered on the coffee table, the eviction notice tucked behind the fruit bowl like a dirty secret. Lillian felt her world tilt on its axis. Malcolm? Her voice was barely a whisper now, fragile as spun glass. Say no, please. Just say no. He ran his hands through his hair. The gesture she'd once found endearing now seemed desperate and pathetic. Lillian, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The people I owe money to, they're not patient men. I don't care, she screamed, her composure finally shattering. I don't care about your debts or your gambling or your stupid, selfish mistakes. I care about us. I care about what we promised each other. But Malcolm's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were calculating something beyond her comprehension. The man she'd married, the one who used to look at her like she hung the moon, was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by someone cold and calculating. $1 million, Lillian, he said finally, his voice hollow. Do you know what we could do with that money? We could start over. We? The word came out strangled. You mean you could start over? After you sell your wife like cattle? The slap of reality hit them both. Malcolm flinched as if she'd struck him physically, but still, he didn't say the words she needed to hear. He didn't say their love was worth more than any amount of money. His silence was an answer in itself, and Lillian felt something die inside her that she feared might never be resurrected. What happens when love is asked to survive the weight of $1 million temptation? 3 days passed in Arctic silence. Lillian moved through their apartment like a ghost, avoiding Malcolm's pleading eyes and desperate attempts at conversation. The eviction notice seemed to grow larger each time she passed it, its red lettering bleeding like an open wound across their lives. On the 4th morning, Malcolm found her standing at the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope she no longer felt. His reflection appeared beside hers in the glass, haggard and broken. They came by yesterday, Tony's men. They gave me 2 more days. Lillian's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug. She'd heard the stories about Tony Marcelli's collection methods, the broken kneecaps, the hospital visits, the people who simply disappeared. It's just 1 night, Malcolm continued, his voice barely audible. 1 night and we're free. We can move somewhere new, start fresh. No more gambling, I promise. No more debts. Just us. She turned to face him, seeing for the first time the purple bruise blooming beneath his left eye, Tony's calling card. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. How can you ask me to do this? Because I love you, he said, reaching for her hands. Because I can't protect you if I'm dead. Because this is the only way out. The words hung between them like a trap. Lillian saw their future stretching out, running, hiding, always looking over their shoulders. She saw Malcolm broken and bleeding, saw herself alone and widowed by his mistakes. 1 night, she whispered, her voice cracking like her heart. And then we're even. No more debts, no more gambling. You swear it. Malcolm nodded eagerly, relief flooding his features. But as Lillian collapsed into his arms, sobbing, neither of them noticed how easily promises could be broken when desperation was the foundation they were built on. Her body was there, but her soul never entered the room. The penthouse suite felt like a gilded prison. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across marble floors, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Lillian stood at the center of it all, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Derek emerged from the bedroom, impeccably dressed in a silk shirt that cost more than her monthly rent. He moved with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, but something in his manner seemed almost respectful. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice carrying none of the crude hunger she'd expected. Instead, there was something almost sad in his eyes, as if he understood the magnitude of what was happening here. Lillian's skin crawled despite his civility. She dressed carefully, not to please him, but to armor herself in dignity. The black dress Malcolm had bought her for their anniversary now felt like funeral attire. Let's just get this over with. Derek poured 2 glasses of wine, the liquid dark as blood in the crystal goblets. He offered her one. "There's no rush," he said. "We have all night." Those words hit her like physical blows. She accepted the wine but didn't drink, watching instead as Derek settled into a chair across from her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken expectations. "You don't have to pretend to enjoy this," he said finally. "I know what this is, what it costs you." Lillian looked up, startled by the genuine regret in his voice. For a moment, she glimpsed something almost human beneath his polished exterior. But then she remembered why she was here, what she'd been reduced to, and her heart hardened again. Then why? If you know what this costs, why do it? Derek's smile was enigmatic and cold. Some prices are worth paying, even when everyone loses. Some men sell what they cannot bear to hear described. Lillian returned home as the sun painted the sky in shades of shame and regret. Her key turned in the lock with mechanical precision, but her hands shook as she pushed open the door to find Malcolm pacing the living room like a caged animal. He looked up at her with eyes wild and desperate, and she saw something there that made her stomach turn. Hunger for details he had no right to know. "How was it?" The question tumbled from his lips before she'd even closed the door. Lillian stared at him, feeling something precious die inside her chest. "How was it?" she repeated, her voice hollow. "How do you think it was, Malcolm? How do you think it felt to be traded like livestock?" The Malcolm stepped closer, his eyes bright with a sickening fascination. "I mean, what did he do? What did you do? Did he—" The slap rang out like a gunshot. Malcolm stumbled backward, his hand flying to his reddening cheek, but the hunger in his eyes didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to intensify. "You want details?" Lillian's voice rose to a scream that seemed to shake the walls. "You want to know how it felt to lie beneath a stranger while thinking about the husband who sold me? You want to know how many times I closed my eyes and imagined I was anywhere else in the world?" Malcolm flinched with each word, but still he pressed forward. "I need to know. I can't stop thinking about it. I keep seeing you with him and I—" "You what? You get jealous? You get excited?" Lillian's laughter was harsh and broken. "You lost the right to be jealous when you cashed that check. You lost the right to know anything about my body when you put a price tag on it." She brushed past him toward the bedroom, but Malcolm grabbed her arm. "Lillian, please, I love you. I need to understand what happened." She turned back to him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him release her immediately. A coldness he'd never seen before. A distance that felt infinite. "What happened is, you stopped being my husband the moment you said yes to that deal." What if the man who bought you never truly wanted you? The knock came 3 days later, soft but insistent. Lillian opened the door to find Derek standing in the hallway, looking somehow smaller outside his penthouse kingdom. Gone was the predatory confidence. In its place stood a man carrying the weight of his own actions. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Lillian's first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something in his demeanor stopped her. Malcolm was at work, or so he claimed, though she suspected he was at the track again, and she found herself curious despite her revulsion. The apartment looked shabbier with Derek in it, his expensive suit making their modest furnishings seem like props in a poverty play. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back like a schoolboy awaiting punishment. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. Apologize? Lillian's laugh was bitter. For what exactly? For making the offer? For going through with it? For treating me like a commodity? For all of it, Derek said quietly, but mostly for what I'm about to tell you. Something in his tone made Lillian's blood run cold. She sank onto the couch, suddenly afraid of what revelation might come next. Derek moved to the window, staring out at the street below. "If I were your wife," he said, his voice barely. "If you were my wife," he said, his voice barely audible, "I would never trade you for anything. Not for all the money in the world, not for all the power, not for anything." The words hit Lillian like physical blows. She felt tears spring to her eyes as the implication of his statement sunk in. "Then why?" "Because I needed to know what kind of man your husband really was. And now, unfortunately, we both do." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of a truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge but could no longer deny. What if betrayal planted not hate but curiosity? Sleep became a stranger in the weeks that followed. Lillian would lie awake beside Malcolm, listening to his breathing and wondering if she'd ever really known him at all. His snores, once a comforting soundtrack to her dreams, now sounded like the grunts of a pig rooting for truffles. During the day, she found herself replaying Derek's words like a broken record. "If you were my wife, I would never trade you for anything." The contrast between his declaration and Malcolm's actions was stark as a neon sign in the darkness of her thoughts. Malcolm tried to return to normal, bringing her flowers, attempting conversation over dinner, reaching for her in the night. But his touch felt foreign now, contaminated by the transaction that redefined their marriage. When he kissed her, she tasted the metallic flavor of betrayal. "We should talk about what happened," he said one evening, cornering her in the kitchen as she washed dishes. Lillian's hand stilled on the plates. "What's to discuss? You sold me. I delivered. Transaction complete." "It wasn't like that," Malcolm protested. "It was survival. It was a choice," Lillian interrupted, finally turning to face him. "You had a choice between protecting your wife and protecting yourself. You chose yourself." The truth hung between them like a blade. Malcolm's face crumpled, and for a moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I love you," he whispered. "Do you?" The question surprised even her. "Or do you love the idea of me, the wife who stands by you, who supports your dreams, who pays for your mistakes?" That night, as Malcolm slept fitfully beside her, Lillian stared at the ceiling and admitted to herself something that terrified her. She was curious about Derek in a way that had nothing to do with his money. He'd seen her at her lowest moment and still spoken of her worth. When was the last time Malcolm had done that? The thought was dangerous, forbidden, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Secrets have a way of becoming weapons in the wrong hands. The whispers started at the grocery store. Lillian noticed them first, the way conversations died when she walked down aisles, the way eyes followed her like accusations. By the time she reached the checkout, the cashier's smile was strained and pitying. "How are you holding up, honey?" the woman asked with fake concern. "I'm fine." "Why?" The cashier's eyes darted away. "Oh, nothing. Just people talk, you know?" By evening, it was clear that their secret had become public entertainment. Malcolm's phone rang constantly. Reporters, friends, strangers offering congratulations or condemnation. The story had spread like wildfire. Local man sells wife for $1 million. "How?" asked Lillian, standing in their living room as Malcolm paced frantically, his phone clutched in his white-knuckled fist. "I don't know," he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "Maybe someone at the poker game. Maybe—" The doorbell rang, cutting him off. Through the peephole, Lillian saw a reporter with a camera crew. More had gathered on the street, their equipment glinting in the streetlights like predatory eyes. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I had nothing to do with this. D." The message should have provided no comfort. Derek was still the man who'd made the offer, who'd participated in her humiliation. But somehow, his denial felt genuine in a way that Malcolm's protest did not. "We need to leave," Malcolm said, watching the crowd grow outside their window. "Pack a bag. We'll go to your sister's." But as Lillian looked at the gathering mob, she realized something had fundamentally changed. They weren't "we" anymore. The transaction had broken something essential between them, and no amount of running could fix it. She was on her own now, and terrifyingly, that prospect felt less frightening than staying with the man who'd sold her dignity for the price of his freedom. Hate is a mask love sometimes wears. The coffee shop was neutral territory, neither Malcolm's world nor Derek's, just a simple place where Lillian could think without the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She'd been coming here for weeks, finding solace in anonymity among strangers who didn't know her story. But today, she wasn't alone. Derek sat 2 tables away, reading a newspaper with studied casualness. He'd been there when she arrived, and something told her his presence wasn't coincidental. When their eyes met across the cafe, she felt a jolt of something she could name: anger, curiosity, and something darker that she didn't want to examine too closely. "Are you following me?" she asked, moving to his table before she could stop herself. "Yes," he said simply, folding the newspaper. "I was worried about you." His honesty was disarming. Malcolm would have denied it, made excuses, lied. But Derek owned his stalking with the same matter-of-fact certainty he owned his indecent proposal. "Why would you worry about me?" Lillian slid into the chair across from him, ignoring the voice in her head that screamed this was dangerous territory. "You could make it stop. The reporters, the stories, one word from you and they'd move on to something else. Is that what you want?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. Lillian realized with shock that she wasn't sure. The attention was horrible, humiliating, but it was also proof that what had happened to her mattered, that it couldn't just be swept under the rug like so many of Malcolm's other mistakes. "I want my life back," she said finally. Derek's smile was sad and knowing. "That's the one thing I can't give you." A man who sells his soul eventually drowns in his own bargain. Malcolm's hand shook as he placed another bet, the casino chips slipping through his fingers like his grip on reality. The $1 million, their supposed salvation, had lasted exactly 6 weeks. First went the immediate debts, then the catch-up payments, then the celebration expenses, and finally the desperate attempts to multiply what remained. Now he sat at a blackjack table at 3 in the morning, trying to win back what he lost while Lillian slept alone in their bed, her back turned to his side like a wall he couldn't breach. "Hit me," he said, though his cards already totaled 18. The dealer's expression was carefully neutral as she dealt the 8 of spades that sealed his fate. Another 1,000 gone, swallowed by the house like all the rest. Malcolm stumbled to the bar, ordering whiskey to numb the voice in his head that sounded remarkably like his father. "You're worthless. You'll never amount to anything. You destroy everything you touch." His phone buzzed with a text from Lillian. "Where are you?" He stared at the message, his vision blurring with alcohol and self-hatred. Where was he? He was in hell, and he dragged the woman he loved down with him. Every day he watched her slip further away, watched the love in her eyes dim until it flickered like a candle in a hurricane. The bartender slid another whiskey across the mahogany, and Malcolm saw his reflection in the amber liquid, distorted, broken, unrecognizable. He'd become everything he'd sworn he'd never be. His father's son, a man who gambled away his family's happiness for the promise of easy money. "I'll make it up to her," he thought, throwing back the whiskey. "One big win, and I'll make it all up to her." But deep down, in the part of his soul that remained untouched by addiction and desperation, Malcolm knew he was lying to himself. The biggest gamble of his life hadn't been at any poker table. It had been trading his wife's dignity for temporary financial relief. And like all his gambles, he lost everything that mattered. What if the man who bought your wife gave her more freedom than her husband ever did? The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by courier to Lillian's workplace with no return address. Inside, she found a cashier's check for $50,000 and a single note. "For your mother's medical bills, no strings attached, D." Lillian's hands trembled as she stared at the check. Her mother's cancer treatment had been draining their already depleted resources, forcing impossible choices between medication and rent. She had mentioned it to no one except Malcolm, who had responded with characteristic helplessness and empty promises. Yet somehow, Derek knew. That evening, she confronted him at his office building, waiting in the lobby until security finally allowed her upstairs. Her assistant tried to stop her, but Derek waved the woman away, his expression unreadable as Lillian stormed into his corner office. "I can't accept this," she said, throwing the cashier's check on his mahogany desk. Derek didn't look up from his computer. "It's a gift, not a transaction. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to buy something else from me." Now he did look up, and Lillian was startled by the genuine hurt in his eyes. "Your mother is dying," he said quietly. "That check could give her 6 more months, maybe a year. Are you really going to let pride kill her?" The words hit like physical blows. Lillian sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly exhausted by the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens. "How do you know about her condition?" "Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer while you're powerless to help. My sister died of the same cancer 3 years ago. I had all the money in the world, and it couldn't save her." The raw pain in his voice was unmistakable. For the first time since this night matter began, Lillian saw Derek not as a predator or a patron, but as a man carrying his own scars of guilt and regret. "Why?" she whispered, After everything that's happened, why would you help me?" Derek's smile was sad and complex. "Because you deserve better than what life has given you, better than what I gave you, better than what he gave you." The unspoken comparison hung in the air between them, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Love doesn't always end with silence. It sometimes ends with screams. The fight erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for months. Lillian walked through the door to find Malcolm rifling through her purse, his face flush with whiskey and desperation. The check, her mother's lifeline, lay crumpled on the coffee table between them like evidence of a crime. "Where did this come from?" Malcolm demanded, holding up her phone with Derek's contact information displayed on the screen. "Give me that." Lillian lunged for the device, but Malcolm jerked it away, his movements clumsy but determined. "You've been seeing him, haven't you? Behind my back, you've been—" "What if I have?" The words exploded from her lips before she could stop them. "What if I have been seeing him? What right do you have to be angry about anything I do after what you put me through?" Malcolm's face went white, then red, then purple with rage. "You're my wife." "No!" Lillian screamed, her voice cracking with months of suppressed fury. "I stopped being your wife the second you put a price tag on me. I became inventory, merchandise, a commodity to be traded. You don't get to play the jealous husband now." Malcolm stumbled backward as if she'd struck him. "I did it for us. Everything I did was for us, for our future." "You did it for yourself." Lillian was shouting now, years of frustration and pain pouring out like water from a broken dam. "You never loved me. You loved the $1 million. You loved the idea of being rescued from your own stupidity." "That's not true." "Prove it," she challenged. "When's the last time you chose me over a bet? When's the last time you put my needs before your addiction? When's the last time you looked at me and saw something other than a solution to your problems?" Malcolm's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of truth he couldn't deny. Then his hand moved, quick as a snake. The slap cracked across Lillian's cheek like a gunshot, sending her stumbling into the wall. They both froze, shocked by the violence that had erupted between them. "Lillian, Malcolm reached for her, his face crumbling with horror at what he'd done. But she was already moving, grabbing her purse and keys, her cheek burning with the imprint of his palm and the death of their marriage. Sometimes walking away is the bravest kind of war. The rain hammered against Lillian's windshield like bullets. As she drove through the night, her face numb from Malcolm's slap and her heart numb from something far worse. She had nowhere to go. Her sister lived 3 states away, her mother was too sick to handle her drama, and her friends had all disappeared when the story broke. Which is why, at 2 a.m, she found herself standing in the marble lobby of Derek's building, dripping rainwater onto Persian rugs worth more than her car. The security guard looked skeptical until she gave her name, then his expression shifted to something like pity. "Mr. Harrison said to expect you," he said, escorting her to the private elevator. "Top floor." The ride up felt like ascending to another world. When the doors opened, Derek stood waiting in his foyer, dressed in pajamas and a silk robe that probably cost more than her monthly salary. But it was his expression that stopped her cold. Not surprise, not satisfaction, just quiet understanding. "He hit you," Derek said, his voice deadly calm as he noticed the red mark on her cheek. Lillian nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the crushing weight of what her life had become. Everything she'd believed in, her marriage, her future, her sense of self, lay in ruins behind her. Without a word, Derek led her to the guest room, a space larger than her entire apartment. He brought her towels, aspirin, and a cup of tea that she couldn't taste through her numbness. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, settling into a chair across from where she sat on the bed. I won't sleep with you again, Lillian said flatly, if that's what you're expecting. I'm not expecting anything, Derek interrupted. You need safety. I have it to give, nothing more. The simple kindness in his voice almost broke her. After months of being treated like property, like a problem to be solved or a debt to be paid, someone was offering her sanctuary with no strings attached. Why, she whispered, after everything, why help me? Derek was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because everyone deserves to be cherished, not sold. What's more dangerous than a man who sold his wife? A man who thinks he's lost her. Malcolm arrived at Derek's building like a hurricane making landfall. 3 days of sleepless nights and endless whiskey had transformed him into something wild and desperate. He pushed past the security guards, shouting Lillian's name as they struggled to restrain him. "Where is she?" he demanded, spittle flying from his lips. "Where's my wife?" The elevator doors opened to reveal Derek, impeccably dressed. Despite the early morning chaos below, he stepped out calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes held a cold fury that even Malcolm's alcohol-soaked brain registered danger. "She's not your wife anymore," Derek said quietly. "You gave up that right when you sold her." "You bastard!" Malcolm lunged forward, but years of soft living and hard drinking had made him clumsy. Derek stepped sideways easily, letting Malcolm crash into the marble wall. "The security is calling the police," Derek continued conversationally. "I suggest you leave before they arrive." Malcolm pulled himself upright, his face bleeding from where he'd scraped against the stone. "She belongs with me. We're married. We took vows." "Vows you broke the moment you cast my check." Derek's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "She came to me beaten and broken, thanks to you. She'll leave when she's ready, if she's ready, but she'll never go back to you." The truth of it nearly brought Malcolm to his knees. He saw himself clearly for the first time in years. A pathetic man who destroyed everything good in his life, chasing fantasies of easy money and quick fixes. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "please let me see her. Let me apologize. Let me try to make this right." Derek's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained iron. "Some things can't be fixed, Malcolm. Some betrayals cut too deep." He stepped back into the elevator, his final words cutting through Malcolm's heart like a blade. "You already gave her away once. She's not coming back." The truth behind the million was darker than anyone imagined. Lillian found Derek on his terrace at sunset, staring out at the city lights as if they held answers to questions he'd never asked aloud. She'd been staying in his penthouse for a week, and their interactions had been carefully polite, like strangers sharing space, rather than two people bound by an intimate transaction. But tonight, something in his posture suggested walls coming down. "I need to tell you something," he said without turning around. "About the offer. About why I made it." Lillian's stomach clenched with dread. She'd begun to think of Derek as her protector, the one person who'd shown her genuine kindness in this nightmare. If that was about to be revealed as another manipulation... "Malcolm and I weren't just friends," Derek continued. "We were business partners 5 years ago. I trusted him with everything, my money, my reputation, my future." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled but still raw. "He stole from me, embezzled nearly $10 million and disappeared, leaving me to face bankruptcy and criminal charges." The words hit Lillian like physical blows. She sank into a chair, her mind reeling with implications she didn't want to understand. "You knew," she whispered. When you made the offer, you knew he'd say yes because you knew exactly what kind of man he was. Derek finally turned to face her, and she saw the weight of his guilt etched in every line of his face. I spent years tracking him down, planning my revenge. I could have destroyed him financially, had him arrested, ruined his life in a dozen different ways. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I wanted him to destroy himself. I wanted him to reveal his true nature to the one person whose opinion mattered most. Me. The word came out strangled. Yes. His honesty was brutal, unflinching. I told myself it was justice, that he deserved to lose everything he cared about the way I had. But watching you walk into that hotel room, seeing what it cost you, he turned away again, his shoulders sagging. I realized I'd become the kind of monster I'd set out to punish. Lillian felt the last vestiges of her trust crumble. Everyone had used her. Malcolm for his debts, Derek for his revenge. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a game between two men, her dignity and pain merely collateral damage in their war. "Get out," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Lillian, get out!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and primal. "Both of you destroyed me for your own purposes. Both of you treated me like I was nothing." Derek moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "somewhere along the way, my revenge became something else. Somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." The admission hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, but Lillian felt nothing. She was done being the object of men's desires, their salvation, their revenge. She was done being anything other than herself. What if the man you hated most showed you more love than your own husband? Sleep became impossible after Derek's revelation. Lillian wandered the penthouse like a ghost, her mind churning through every interaction, every kindness, every moment of what she thought was genuine care. Had any of it been real, or had she simply been a more elaborate victim in his game of revenge? Yet even as rage consumed her, she couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. Derek hadn't forced himself on her after that first night. He'd offered her sanctuary when she had nowhere to go. He'd paid her mother's medical bills with no expectation of repayment. He'd shown her a respect and consideration that Malcolm never had, even before the proposal. The contradiction was driving her insane. 3 days passed in icy silence. Derek left her space, communicating only through notes left on the kitchen counter. Updates on her mother's treatment, offers to arrange transportation if she wanted to leave, gentle inquiries about her needs. His consideration felt like salt in her wounds, a reminder of what kindness looked like when it came from someone who'd orchestrated her destruction. On the 4th day, she found him in his study, staring at photographs scattered across his desk. She recognized some of them. Pictures of Malcolm from their college days, business documents, financial records, the evidence of his investigation into her husband's betrayal. "How long?" she asked from the doorway. "How long what? How long did you know about me? How long were you watching before you made your move?" His silence was answer enough. Lillian felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been shattered weeks ago, but her last illusion about human decency. 2 years, he finally admitted. "I've been watching your marriage fall apart for 2 years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. You watched me suffer," she said, her voice hollow. "You watched him gamble away our security, our happiness, our future, and you did nothing to help. You just waited." Yes. The simple admission was somehow worse than any elaborate justification would have been. Lillian stared at this man who'd become her sanctuary and her destroyer, and she realized she no longer knew how to feel about anything. "I loved him," she whispered. "Despite everything, despite his flaws and his addiction and his weakness, I loved Malcolm. And you took that away from me." "No," he said quietly. "He did that himself. I just accelerated the process." Desperation makes men roll dice with fire. The underground poker game operated in the basement of a warehouse where desperate men came to lose what little they had left. Malcolm sat at a table surrounded by sharks who could smell his desperation like blood in the water. His last $1,000, money meant for groceries and utilities, lay in the center of the table like an offering to gods who only accepted sacrifice. "Call," he said, his voice hoarse from 3 days of cigarettes and whiskey. The cards fell like guillotine blades. A pair of jacks stared up at him, mocking him with their inadequacy. Across the table, Vincenzo Torino, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him into every room, smiled like death itself. "Full house, friend," Vincenzo said, spreading his cards like a funeral shroud. "Aces over kings." Malcolm's world tilted. The 1,000 was gone, swallowed by the house and Vincenzo's predatory grin. But instead of walking away, instead of accepting defeat and going home to figure out how to survive, Malcolm heard his father's voice echoing in his head. "Double or nothing, boy. That's how winners are made." "I need to borrow," he said, the words tumbling from his lips before sanity could stop them. Vincenzo's smile widened. "What collateral you got, friend?" Malcolm's mind raced through his assets. The apartment was already mortgaged to the hilt. His car wasn't worth the gas in its tank. His wife had left him for the man who'd bought her. He had nothing left to lose except the deed to my apartment building. It's worth $200,000. I'll put it all up for one hand. The table fell silent. Even hardened gamblers recognized the sound of a man's soul being wagered. Vincenzo's eyes glittered with predatory interest. "One hand," he agreed. "Winner takes all." Malcolm's hand shook as he picked up his cards. 2 kings smiled up at him like old friends, and for a moment, he felt the familiar rush of possibility. This was it, the big score that would change everything, that would win back Lillian's respect and love. The flop came down. King of hearts, 7 of clubs, 2 of spades. 3 of a kind. Malcolm's heart soared as he pushed his deed into the center of the table, certain that fortune had finally smiled upon him. It wasn't until Vincenzo laid down his straight flush that Malcolm realized he'd just gambled away the last roof over his head. Love isn't always about who wins. It's about who refuses to sell. The knock came at dawn, soft but insistent. Lillian opened the door to find Malcolm standing in the hallway, and the sight of him nearly broke her heart. Gone was any pretense of dignity or pride. He stood before her hollow-eyed and broken, wearing the same clothes he'd had on 3 days ago. "I lost everything," he said simply. "The apartment, the car, everything. I have nowhere else to go." Behind her, she heard Derek's footsteps on the marble floor. He appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, his expression cold as winter steel. "You have some nerve," Derek began, but Lillian held up a hand to stop him. "Let him speak." Malcolm's voice cracked as he continued. "I know what I did to you was unforgivable. I know I broke something between us that can never be fixed. But I'm asking, no, I'm begging for one last chance. Come away with me. We'll start over somewhere new. I'll get help, go to meetings, whatever it takes." The desperation in his eyes was painful to witness. This was the man she'd married, stripped of all his defenses and illusions, reduced to his most basic self, and that self was still asking her to save him. "Malcolm, you don't need me to get help. You need to want to get help for yourself." "I do want it," he insisted, "but I need you. I can't do it alone." From behind her, Derek spoke. "Lillian, you owe him nothing. Stay here. Let me take care of you." She turned to look at him, this complex man who destroyed her life and then tried to rebuild it, who'd used her for revenge and then fallen in love with her, who'd shown her kindness wrapped in manipulation. "And be what? Your kept woman? Your guilt project? Your way of atoning for what you did?" Both men stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. It occurred to her that neither of them had ever considered what she might want, what she might choose if given actual agency in her own life. "I'm not going with either of you," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Malcolm, you need to face your demons alone. And Derek, you need to find a way to live with what you've done that doesn't involve me." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her heart beating out a new rhythm, the rhythm of a woman choosing herself for the first time in years. Sometimes the biggest twist is walking away from both men. 6 months later, Lillian stood on the balcony of her small apartment overlooking the ocean, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of freedom. The apartment wasn't much, a far cry from Derek's penthouse or even the modest place she'd shared with Malcolm, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every breath of air belonged to no one but her. The money from Derek's check, the $1 million that had started this nightmare, sat in an investment account, slowly growing into her mother's continued treatment and her own future. She'd taken it not as payment for services rendered, but as compensation for damages inflicted. Both men had used her. The least they could do was fund her recovery. Her phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. "Day 127 sober. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when you gave up on us." She smiled, genuinely happy for his progress. Losing everything, his wife, his home, his illusions, had been the wake-up call he'd needed. Last she'd heard, he was working in construction and attending daily AA meetings. They would never be together again, but she was glad he was finding his way back to being human. A second text arrived, this one from Derek. "The gallery opening is next week. Your paintings deserve to be seen." She'd started painting again, something she'd abandoned years ago when Malcolm's needs had consumed all her time and energy. Derek had been quietly supporting her art, not as a lover or a patron, but as someone trying to make amends. They would never be together either, but his guilt had at least produced something beautiful. The sunset deepened, and Lillian felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Contentment, not happiness. That would come later with time and healing, but the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on her own terms. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, dependent, defined entirely by her relationship to men who saw her as a solution to their problems rather than a person worthy of love. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood that her worth couldn't be bought, sold, or traded. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility as Lillian raised her coffee cup in a solitary toast. "Here's to learning that the only person who can save you," she said to the empty air, "is yourself." In the distance, the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, taking with it the last traces of the woman she used to be, and leaving behind someone entirely new,
someone who belonged only to herself.
Thank you for watching. Please tell us where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for the next love story.